Hey everybody, this is Aquila from a Lefty Knitter podcast, and I am doing a voiceover on this video I shot on how to make a cast-on bonnet for your circular sock machine. This was a requested video from a few people, so let's get started. So you don't need a cast-on bonnet to start your project. There are other ways, but this is a preferred method in all honesty, because if not, you're kind of wrapping scrap yarn around all your needles, and it kind of looks like a hot mess. It's hard to grab onto with the weights, so this is definitely a preferred method. So this is my current cast-on bonnet on my 64 stitch Erlbacher Gearhart Speedster machine, and I am just putting the bonnet on every other needle at this point. I'm going to apologize in advance because I know my hand is going to get in the way. So that is your buckle, and you're going to put your buckle onto your bonnet and then hang your weight from your bonnet. I have my weights in a beer koozie so they don't all fall off. This is waste yarn that I'm going to use to help start this project. I am just taking that waste yarn and threading it through my mast so it is ready to go into my machine. I do have a yarn carrier that has the split in it, and I can't think of the official name for that, but you can then crank your machine around and finish hanging those stitches from your bonnet. So now you are just going to crank until you get to a few rows. I do approximately 8 to 12 rows. That gives you enough fabric that it is not going to, come apart on you when you're working on this project. I've now gotten to the end, and I always stop at my 3 o'clock mark on my machine, and I'm going to pull that end in, and I am going to use a ravel cord. The ravel cord I have is fishing line that I purchased, and I believe it is a 65-pound weight line, and I just bought that on Amazon. And you're gonna start that ravel cord on one needle, and you will stop on the needle right before the first needle that you started on so they do not overlap. And you're gonna pull that into the inside of your cylinder. Now you are ready to start with your project yarn. I am using leftovers of Knit Picks Felici Electric Lime. This is just what I had on hand. I knew it was going to be enough to do the job, because you do want to make your bonnet long enough that the weight will grab onto it, that you can use your buckle and your weight and grab onto that setup bonnet. Because if it's too short, then you're trying to reach up into the inside of your cylinder. So again, I am starting my project yarn on that first needle, and you need to make sure you reset your counter, because you will be doing a hung hem, and you want to have the same amount of rows before and after the picot edge that we are going to create. The picot is what makes the loops, and that's what you hang onto your machine for your setup bonnet. I did 15 rows, and you stop before you get to the full 15th turn. So before you get to that needle. So you did 14 3/4 turns. I was just pointing to the needles, and you are going to take the first stitch, transfer it to the stitch next to it. So one goes on to the second needle, then the third stitch goes onto the fourth needle, and so forth and so on. So you are just transferring every other stitch to the next needle. Make sure you stay consistent and switch that stitch to the next needle before or after. That is totally up to you. I find it easier to remember that I'm just taking 1 to 2 and 3 to 4, 5 to 6, 6 to 7, and so forth. My hands are definitely getting in the way, and I am still trying to figure out the best way to record videos like this for you guys, because I have one camera. If I had a second camera to film with, I could do multiple shots and then overlay them here in this editing program, but I do not have that. So I'm going to fast forward this so we can get to the end of me transferring these stitches. Actually, I am not going to fast forward. I've gotten pretty far here, and at this point you are going to get to where the needles are going down into your cylinder. You will need to finish cranking forward. So when you do crank forward, you will be cranking into the stitches that you just transferred. So the next row is going to have 2 stitches on each needle. So you want to make sure you go slow, make sure you're not zooming around, and then you can move your yarn carrier close to the 12 o'clock position and keep transferring your stitches, only because they were down in the cylinder bed and you would not have been able to transfer those. So finish transferring until you get back to the last stitch, in this case 64, transferring stitch 63 to 64. I didn't mention that I'm using the Addi pick tool to do this. This is your preference also. You can use any pick tool that you have on hand. I am just pulling the needle out from the cylinder a little bit, you can kind of see that, and making it easier and accessible to get to that stitch. So I did not get all the way around. Some of my needles were still down under my V-cam, and you can see where we already cranked that, say 16th row, that, you know, that you can see the space, like the yarn over. So now you are going to crank the same amount of rows that you cranked previously. So you can do 10 rows and then picot and then 10. You can do 15. It is totally, again, your preference. Stopping before you get to your first needle. I remove my weights to do my hung hem. Some people do not do this. When you remove your weights and you are tucking, you're pulling up the tube inside your cylinder to get to your first row, which in this case is 30 rows down, the needles that are starting to go down in the bed, I was just pointing to them, the stitches rise up a little. It can be a little scary. So that is totally your preference. You could have left your weights on and kind of lifted them with your legs just to give yourself a little ease to pull that tube up. I just take it off. That's just what I do. Again, your preference. If you're very new, you might not be comfortable taking that off all the way. So at this point, because I have my ravel cord on the first stitch, and I always use the same stitch, I know that the stitch right above that ravel cord, that end ravel cord, I'm going to transfer onto that first needle. So that is what I'm doing right now. So you're doubling your fabric. You're going to have 2 stitches on every needle. Again, so you're going to want to work slow when you crank this first round. And you just do this all the way around, kind of how we did with the picot. You're going to have to stop and crank forward to be able to access the stitches that are down in the cylinder. This is where it gets tricky, y'all. So, once you have hung your stitches, you need to crank forward very easily. Now there's no weight. You do not have any weight there. So I am adding my weight back on, and there still technically is not a lot of weight on those stitches that are only single stitches. So you want to use your hands, as you can see me doing, pushing down in that little cupped area, because if not, and you crank forward, there's no weight holding that down, and those stitches can easily pop off those needles. I did not take my weight fully off at this point. I am now just lifting it with my legs because the tube is accessible to hang those stitches. And you're just gonna finish hanging all of those to create your hung hem. That is exactly what you're doing. So if you have not made a hung hem yet on your socks, this is exactly how you would do a hung hem. You could do that picot edge on the top and it would give a cute little decoration. You do not have to do the picot edge, and you can just crank 20 rows, do a hung hem, then the hem of your sock would be a 10-row hem. Cuff. Sorry, not a hem. A cuff. I need to crank forward a little bit. Oh, I lied. I did take my weight off. See? Big fat liar here. I didn't realize I actually took my weight off. I've done it both ways, where I've taken it off and just held it with my legs. Crank forward. Finish hanging all of those 64 stitches. It can get a little tricky trying to find that last one or two stitches. And also a thing to remember is, if you're not using ravel cord, you do want to use a waste yarn that has a pretty good contrast. If you're not using something that has a contrast, you are not gonna really see where your waste yarn ends and your first row of project yarn begins. So now we're just gonna crank. So I'm just going slow on that first row, and here we go. I knew I was going to need both of my scrap Felici yarn to finish this, and right now I'm going to show you how I do a Russian join. So this is another little skill you'll get in this video. You will crank until you have a tail that you can double back onto itself and go underneath a couple of needles. This is not the best angle to stop at, so I apologize. So you are going to take your tail, put it into your machine, just like if you were starting a brand new yarn. You're going to kind of tuck it into a couple needles, crank forward. Now, you've done that. Your tail is sticking out, but you now have doubled up your yarn, and you have a couple needles that have 2 stitches on it. You now have this loop that's hanging out from your yarn carrier. You take your new yarn, you loop that in, and you hold tight, and you keep going, and you will have double stitches on all the needles from where you ended your first yarn, started your new yarn to where the tail is. These tails are now tucked in. You have to do nothing with them. They're not going to pop out. Usually you want to make sure they're at least 2 or 3, probably more than that, 5 or 6 stitches wide. So I am now checking to see how long my setup bonnet is, and I want it to be a little bit longer. Now, you could practice toes at this point and make a toe on the end of your setup bonnet, or you can finish by picking up all the stitches with a needle, which is what the method I'm going to show you right now. So you cut your yarn so you have a long enough tail, and you tuck it down in your machine. You will take waste yarn and put that onto your project, and then take your project off the machine. This is where we're headed. I don't know what I was doing, why I was so slow, not quite sure what was going on here. That is my waste yarn. I'm going to put that in, thread it in my yarn carrier, and crank again the amount of rows that you are comfortable with. When I send out objects from my Etsy shop, I do 13 rows, but when I'm doing stuff for myself, it's probably more like 8 or 9. Tuck that in, hold your project, and take it off your machine. You crank forward and it comes off your machine. You now have your setup bonnet, and you can remove it using the ravel cord, which is what I had, or you will snip your waste yarn and take your project off of your waste yarn. This was super awkward, and I did not even show how well to do that. But you stick your pick in and you pull it out from the opposite side of where the ends are. And, you know, untangle that mess. It's not really a mess. It's just the ends from your project yarn and waste yarn are all tucked into the same tube, so you have to just manage that. The only end you have to kind of tuck in is the starting edge, but there you go. There's the hung part and the picot at the top. I'm trying to visually just show you what you would do. Take the yarn tail, put it on a needle, and then pick up every stitch, but I do eventually show you this in the video. I wasn't going to, and then I went and got something to cover my machine because I kept hitting the needles and pulling them up and getting them caught on my project. So the yarn tail is now on my needle, and you are going to pick up every stitch. We're gonna fast forward this. I think you guys can figure this part out. Okay, we are back at the beginning, and I've went through every stitch. I think I may even go through one more. I don't remember. I make such great tutorials. I tuck my ends down into my project, and I then remove the waste yarn from my bonnet. And here we go. This is always the fun part. I don't know. I save all my scraps too. I have a bucket of little tiny balls of waste yarn that I reuse over and over again until they are, well, unusable. Sometimes the first stitch and last stitch overlap, or the yarn overlaps, say, on the first stitch, so you have to kind of unpick it, but that is easy enough to figure out. So once you have unpicked your waste yarn, you will now pull tight and manipulate your tube a little bit so it's not completely all scrunched in, and you'll close it off. So just like you would close off if you're a hand knitter, say a hat at the top, you know, you're pulling those last 8 to 10 stitches tight, you're gonna do that here. So I just take my needle again and I go through in the same direction, just a few stitches. I think I go all the way around at this point, a few stitches here, a few stitches there. Again, you could do a toe. You could practice different toes to make on the bottom of your bonnet. It is not necessary to have this pulled closed super tight unless you are planning on using, say, soft weights inside of your bonnet. I know some people do that versus using weights that hang. I do not. So I am now just gonna push that to the inside of the project, tie it off the tiniest little bit, and snip it off. Again, this is inside of your cast on bonnet. No one's really gonna see it, and yeah, there you go. Now you do have this one end that was at the beginning of your project. You can take a needle and weave it in, or I'm gonna show you with a latch hook tool this cool little trick that you can do. So I bought a set of different latch hooks when I got my machine for picking up dropped stitches on my machine. I am just going through the leg of a few stitches. It was hard at first to get it to manipulate. This is not the smallest latch tool and probably not the best latch tool for this job, but I do use this when I pick up stitches when I drop them on my sock machine. So I've now picked up legs. I'm gonna put that tail into the hook, the latch hook, and close the latch and pull my tail through. I think this is a quick and easy, fun little trick to do. Then you can snip it. There you go. Pretty cool. Snip. And there is your cast on bonnet. I love that color. That is so much fun. And I'm gonna just show you the tiniest little bit of hanging it, because when you have a new cast on bonnet, those stitches do not stick up very high. After you've used it a while, weight on your cast on bonnet will make them more pronounced, and you'll be able to find them much easier to hang on your machine. And there you go, guys. Look at that, a cast on bonnet. I know you can do it. Tag me, let me know if you made one. Yay! Take care, bye.